Okay, this is the audio for Chapter 2, Manufacturing Difference, the social construction of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Identities. So we have multiple identities, and this affects our situational perspective. So our understandings of the world are shaped by our specific social location, meaning our place within the hierarchies of identity. So our age, our gender, our race, our sexuality, our class. All of these things shape what kind of power and privilege that we have, what access or not access we have. So we're stratified across these things. And so as a result, these things shape our experiences, right? So your experience of life is going to differ based on, if you have a disability or not, what your social class experience is, etc. So it's through these kind of intersecting, interwoven identities that we actually experience together that we develop our situational perspectives. So there's different ways that people understand identity. First, there's the essentialism argument, which is just kind of back in vogue these days. Essentialism basically has a biological focus that really ignores context and culture. So essentialism says that there is no such thing as gender, there's only biological sex, and the biological sex is dichotomous, that heterosexuality is biologically the only normal sexuality expression, which again, not true. But again, these things are tied to biological expressions, which ironically, when it comes to biological expressions of actual biological sex, we dichotomize these things, but they're actually much more complicated, right? As there are people who are born intersexed, and that kind of complicates this dichotomous notion that there's one or the other, right? So essentialism really says if you are born in a body with a XX chromosome and you have female biological sex characteristics, that therefore you are gendered female and you will be heterosexual and be interested in men, right? So there's a lot of these weird assumptions that come with essentialism, that all of these things are somehow connected and immutable, meaning what you have at birth is what you got. That's it, right? If you were born into an XY chromosomal makeup, into male sex characteristics, then you will be heterosexual, you will desire women, and you will have a gender expression as male. We know in reality those things aren't true, right? There's much more complexity to the human experience, but essentialists really, basically believe that it's just a biological origin. Culture plays no impact on these things, right? Versus constructionists really challenge that. They say that our identities depend on social contexts, meaning what we define as normative and natural is what we actually accept for the culture. So, if heterosexuality is kind of woven into all of our cultural institutions, such as marriage, then we come to construct it as much more normative and much more desirable than homosexuality, right? So again, our identities also reflect social rankings and power relationships, meaning when we stratify these different identities on a hierarchy, we place some at the top, meaning that their expression is rewarded or privileged in the culture, right? Versus if you're at the bottom of any of these social hierarchies, you're going to experience a lot more marginality and oppression, right? So obviously social class is a real clear example of that. The richer you are in our capitalistic society, the more social rewards there are for that, meaning you have more credibility, more desirability in the culture versus, the opposite end of that spectrum. The more impoverished you are, the less credible you seem, the less desirable, right? So again, these identities really reflect social rankings and power relations, which don't make sense in a just purely biological context, right? They're a social thing. And also, all of these identities tend to make us think in terms of opposites or these dichotomies, right? So a lot of our identities in our culture are structured as dualities, like male or female, black or white, gay or straight, right? All of these things create a false dichotomy that there's only two things and you have to choose one or the other, which makes it a much more simplified system that you can then police the boundaries of those expressions pretty easily, right? So that's why a lot of people get really shaken up when you talk about these things from a constructionist point of view, because to challenge these underlying systems that we just kind of expect to be dichotomies and complicating them with third or fourth categories, people get often nervous because then they don't know how to reconceptualize the institutions that they live with every day, right? So, there's a lot of identifiers that we have that are psychological, such as social class or gender, these things, but there's also obviously structural meanings, like what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what kind of things are acceptable for them in different social institutions like religion or economy or the family or whatever it might be, right? These things they don't come out of nowhere. They're not just something that's in your DNA, right? Your biological codes. It's something that's developed as a context of historical and cultural, processes within a particular society, right? Okay, so when it comes to social construction of race and ethnicity, meanings are linked to the social context, meaning that what it means to be a certain race or ethnic category has actually changed a lot over time. So people assume that these things are biological categories and that they're rigid. But in reality, they're not rigid. They actually change in definition, right? This kind of thing that we call, racial processing, that they develop different meanings as the relationship between this group and society changes over time. So again, racial categories aren't natural, right? If you've ever seen the famous blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment, then you know what I'm talking about, that prejudice and discrimination is something we learn, right? And so, there's this kind of famous experiment where kids were divided in a classroom by the color of their eyes, right? Basically because the teacher herself was trying to make a point that prejudice is something we learn, but it's also something that's completely arbitrary, meaning that, to have blue eyes or brown eyes doesn't necessarily imbue you with different qualities, right? So she said, well, people that have blue eyes are clearly more trustworthy, right? And people that have brown eyes are this, and that. So she constructed them as different categories. And the interesting part was that not only did the children that were not being valued in the study, right, that were being seen as less than, not only were they actually feel the brunt of that discrimination, but the children that were privileged in the study actually did feel like they deserved that privilege. Like maybe these kids with different eye colors were worse than them, right? So it just kind of shows that we buy into these things, especially when we're in the the more powerful part of that hierarchy. We're more likely to buy into the fact that we deserve to be there, right? That we deserve power, prestige, credibility, these kind of things. The blue-eyed, brown-eyed thing has been replicated many times, and I'll put it up in the additional resources, but it just really kind of gets to how, even children can understand this, and how she did the experiment specifically because she taught in a school when MLK was shot, and she had to go into a class of just white students and try and explain to them what had happened. So she developed this blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment to kind of show what that experience of discrimination was to young kids that, because of their own racial privilege, may not have had that experience, right? So anyway, blah, blah, blah. I'll just keep talking about it if you let me. So again, another way that we look at how racial categories change is through demography, right? So like the census itself is a good measure of this, how racial categories that are even allowed to be checked as a box on the census have changed a lot. And different ethnicities of people have actually conformed to different racialized groups, meaning during some times in American history, a lot of groups that we wouldn't consider part of this pan-ethnic category of white have been included in that category for the racial, at least for the racial categorization of the census in the past, meaning that these things weren't understood in the same way as they are now. So another thing that really affects our dualistic thinking is multiracial identities. So this breaks down a lot of the assumptions of differences that we have between races. And this also means, at least I think it has a lot to do with why people get very, they have a need to identify people that are mixed race. It's this very interesting thing, like, what are you? Where do you come from? Like I have a friend that he's half Russian, half Japanese, and people have a weird time with that, where they have to like, what are you? Right? Because we have such a very basic understanding of racial groupings that there's really only like four pan-ethnic categories that everyone just gets kind of squeezed into. So if you have any of those borderlines that you break, people, that gets very complicated. And again, this was policed so much in the United States that this has become a very recent phenomenon in even research or scholarship or understanding, because literally it was outlawed to marry someone or have a, sexual or, what otherwise romantic relationship with someone outside of your racial category. So this has been something that was literally enforced by the state in this country. So it makes sense that it's obviously, since those laws have been lifted, there's been a huge uptick in interracial marriage and interracial relationships, but this is still kind of a developing issue that we have to kind of wrestle with in the public consciousness, because for this being basically invisible for so long and really restricted for so long, we are only now starting to kind of grapple with these identities that form at the intersections of different races, right? You're going to experience different things in different ways as a result, and it further complicates it. So it just shows nothing is black or white, or male or female, like these kind of dichotomies, this or, right? This that forces us to think this or that. When in reality, a lot of these things are much, much, much more complex. And again, categories do not really reflect the way that people are experiencing race, because again, people experience their race and ethnicity in relation to their social location. So your social class will affect how you experience your race, right? If you're very privileged wealthily, your experience of being a racial minority may be very different than someone who is a racial minority and also very poor, or also has a disability, or is also, it maybe has different social categories that are also maligned in our culture, like being LGBTQ or intersexed, or any of these kind of things that would obviously complicate your experience of race, and just shows that none of these things are, monolithic. They're not like, oh, all, groups, all white people experience this, all Latinos experience that. Like, obviously not, because how you actually experience these things is going to be mitigated through all those other identities. All right, when it comes to social class, a social class is just people who share a similar economic position in society. So this relates a lot to caste systems, right? Stratifications that are based on birth, that separate people and basically, give certain rights and opportunities to the higher castes and eliminate those opportunities for lower castes. And there's really no social mobility in a caste system, right? Social mobility is the ability to move up or down a social class. So in our system, we obviously have from upper class to underclass. And a lot of people argue it is somewhat of a caste system because the majority of people end up dying in the social class that they were born into. There's very few opportunities for the masses to achieve social mobility, at least within their own lifetime. Oftentimes, social mobility is achieved through saving in your generation, so that your children might have more opportunities or something like that. And then they move up a social class, right? Because they were able to go to college when their parents were laborers and etc., right? That kind of thing. But social mobility within an actual one generation lifetime, that's kind of why you're in college, right? You want that piece of paper where they're going to be like, here's more money. So social mobility is one of those things obviously linked to education, but as education itself is stratified, we'll talk about later, that's a problem. So again, poverty is just those who are defined as poor, and related to, obviously in our governmental standard, we have the poverty line, which some people argue leaves a gap between those who actually experience hardships due to poverty and those who actually hit a economic threshold that necessitates immediate need, right? But anywho, basically we know within our social class system that those people that have the most access to everything, right? They want for nothing. Versus those in poverty are challenged to even provide the basic necessities for their family, like shelter, food, right? Clothing, a decent education, a safe environment, right? Those kind of things. while the rich have more than ample opportunities for these things. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, much more in depth, about how a lot of this wealth inequality that's at a staggering level in our current system has really come to be, and really what can be done about it to kind of reinstill a much more fair and legitimate society, right? In our culture, we have this myth of the meritocracy that we all have the same opportunities. But in a social class system that's so locked out, we just simply don't have the same opportunities. All right, gender identities. So obviously, before getting into some of the discussion, since a lot of people use sex and gender kind of you know as parallels to each other. I mean, they're somewhat related, but obviously they are different. Sex is a biological marker for maleness, femaleness, right, or intersexuality, while gender is the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of what is considered masculinity, femininity, or other. So, gender is really just how we perform and interpret our understandings of being male or female, right? In a dualistic gender sense. So, this is why a lot of people construct the two as related, because for a lot of people, their biological sex characterization is also the same as their gender expression. Like, that's a lot of people. But at the same time, these two things are not the same just because they align for a lot of people. For a lot of people, they don't. And so it's much more complicated, right? So, in recent years, more scholarship has looked at this, more social movements have been organized around this. And so really there's been a lot more conversation and dialogue and really kind of like coming up with, nomenclature to understand a lot of these changes or challenges to gender binaries. So first, obviously, transgender, right? It's really interesting when you get to the basics of what is it to be transgender. It's pretty much just challenging dualistic understandings of gender. So in a way, all of us, when we transgress in any way, like if you are female and you wear something masculine, act masculine in a presentation or whatever it might be, challenge those boundaries of things that are expected of you. If you're male and you are good at things that are considered gendered as female, like such as cooking, or you enjoy certain activities that are much more gendered as female, like getting a pedicure or something like that. We're all actually challenging those binaries when we live in an actual reality, right? In a reality where we are who we are, regardless of what the society tells us to do, right? We still have our beliefs and preferences. But to actually live as someone in that category of transgender is a whole nother thing, right? To actually have it as a social identity that you claim is much more, complex, right? That's where people often just do not align with, their sexual categorization does not align with that same gender performance. And sometimes it's not even about fitting into that dualistic system, as some people do feel like, well, I feel more masculine and I want to present myself in a gender that's male, right? Some people want to present themselves as more female, right? But then there's much more complicating this even, because early understandings of trans people was a lot more about like getting surgeries and, are you male to female? Are you female to male, right? But these things are being much more complicated as a lot more people opt to not have surgeries. And it's really not anyone's business whether they do or not. Also, it's much more complicated to just be non-binary or agender, meaning you don't really identify with a gender, right? You just are who you are, right? You're not necessarily masculine, you're not necessarily feminine. And this really blows people's brains, right? Because they have a hard time even conceptualizing how do you live, right? Because gender is such a lens that we see people through to either treat them a certain way or not, to think if they're competent or not, right? Like if you're going to have someone take care of your children, right? How their gender presentation is affects how you think they're qualified or not. If you have someone trying to fly your plane, their gender their gender matters to you. And it's unfortunate that we've been socialized in such a way to believe only certain groups are qualified for certain tasks, right? This is obviously just a construction. So when people challenge this, we challenge them, right? It becomes a problematic identity in the culture. So, anywho, all of us do gender, right? Gender is a performance. It's something that we do in how we wear our hair, right? How we talk, how we dress, what our hobbies are that we do, all of it. It's all performance, right? We choose to do those things, meaning, obviously, in some ways, different gender expressions are given more room than others. Like women are given more room to kind of express themselves through their clothing than men are, right? Like I can wear pants or I can wear a dress and no one really scoffs either way. Like if I wear pants, no one's pelting me with raw vegetables in the street or rotten vegetables. But, if a guy wears a skirt to class, then it becomes a problem for him, right? So, it's interesting how we do limit certain gender expressions, and a lot of this just has to do with the gender hierarchy, right? Where if men are perceived to be doing anything lower than that presentation of masculinity, then it's considered femininity, right? And less than. So it's kind of feared against, and same thing with this kind of homosexuality fear, right? This homophobia that comes along with a lot of gender policing. For a lot of young men, if they are told to be a man or, man up or whatever it might be, they are often constructed around this idea of you don't want to be considered a woman, you don't want to be considered homosexual, right? Those are the fears. Why? Because they're lower on a social hierarchy than heterosexual. It's lower on a social hierarchy than male, right? So, but that's kind of like not the explained part. You just have the fear behind it to say, oh, well, I don't want to be treated marginally, right? No one does. So, anywho, gender. Getting back to that, we all perform gender. And obviously, there's social forces that say what's appropriate for us and what's not. But we have agency. We can just do kind of whatever the hell we want. And in recent years, people are starting to kind of realize this more and more and really transgress in ways that make their lives better, that make them feel more comfortable and happy, and just kind of ignore the societal norm that constrains all of us in our expression of gender. Alrighty, sexual dichotomy. All right, so again, another thing our culture is built around is this dichotomous notion of division of sex into only male or female, when technically there's variation, right? There's at least five, well, according to Anne Fausto Sterling, you got like five different biological sexual characterizations, but there's obviously various ways in which intersexuality presents itself. And so all of our institutions, though, they only accept male or female, right? So it's kind of built into our system, this sexual dichotomy. So we believe it because if you look at the form, it only says male or female, right? And so I think the saddest part of this, too, is the intersexuality issue where we are forcing all of these, compliance, I guess, upon intersexuals to monitor their bodies, to change their bodies, to fit a standard that we philosophically thought up, right? It's kind of terrible. So anyway, so transsexuals are just people who identify with different sex than their biological one. So not to be confused with transgender, though a lot of people do. Transsexuality is a bit different. Transgender is really just your gender expression, how you choose to perform your actual gender expression, versus transsexuality is much more about changing, your sexual characteristics to align yourself with that kind of older dichotomous understanding. So again, just really identifying as different than the biological characteristics you were assigned as, right? So oftentimes there's a lot of different narratives. Sometimes it's like, I think it's a little oversimplified, but the narrative of like being trapped in the wrong body, right? That kind of thing. Because again, it kind of creates this weird thing of like you have to hate yourself, you have to whatever, which is like obviously a terrible narrative. But that is kind of a way that a lot of people understand it, as kind of never feeling right with the biological characteristics that you've had, right? So obviously many cultures have different ways to deal with these complexities of not just intersexuality, but also those expressions of gender or not feeling right within, your biological characteristics. So, this is a lot of, again, how our culture our culture says there's only dichotomies. You're this or you're that, and that's it. And there's a good one and a bad one for all the dichotomies, right? But all over the world, there's third genders or complexities or the ways that intersexuals live, right? And so this shows how our culture really constructs our way as right, but there is no right. So there's examples everywhere, right? The Barachi, the Two Spirits, right? Obviously, a lot of people have heard of various Native American cultures that kind of had this understanding of Two Spirit. People who kind of inhabited this place, almost like a sacredish or revered place between, not just one extreme or another. But again, there's like an interesting video I'm going to put in your additional resources about them. There's also the Hiras, right? There's this great Vice documentary about them that, again, kind of gets back to that essentialism and constructionism argument, right? If we're born and that's it, and we have some birth assignment, in that philosophy, there can be no variations, right? There can only be dichotomies. But the thing is, dichotomies contradict the reality of biological variation, let alone gender expression, right? Which is much more varied and much more nuanced. Meaning, if you think about just even like your closest couple friends, how they present, even if they're all the same gender, how they present that gender is different. Meaning, you have some friends that are more masculine or more feminine than others, right? No matter if they're male or female. So these things are so much more complex, but we like to try and squeeze everyone together. Though again, around the world, you can see all sorts of different groups of people that kind of represent this in between or this other space outside of a dichotomy. But oftentimes, our culture kind of rejects this because it doesn't fit within the institutions that we already have, right? So, though, again, a lot of that is changing a little bit. Like I mentioned, Colorado was one of the first states now that would acknowledge intersexuality in a birth certificate. So that's a good step. But at the same time, everywhere across the U.S., there's these pressures, right, to fix infants. Since we believe so firmly in the binary, we have no ability to classify intersexed infants on birth certificates. So often doctors perform medically unnecessary surgeries on these infants so that they fit the box on the birth certificate. So think about it. The first thing people say is it a boy or a girl? And the reality is that there are more people born intersex than are born with Down syndrome, right? But we've heard of Down syndrome. But at the same time, a lot of people refute that intersexuals even exist, right? Because of their philosophy of how things work, not because of science or observable reality, right? And so parents will feel pressured to allow these surgeries because they're told their child would struggle and would be considered a freak. So it's better to go through with these unnecessary genital surgeries. There's this article I make my students read in my sexualities class where this doctor's quoted as saying, it's easier to change the child than change society, which is sad, but it's twisted, right? So again, a lot of those assumptions underlying essentialism, the binary, they're not scientific reality, right? Some people are not born male or female, but have some variation or even sometimes characteristics of both. And some people are born with mixed sex characteristics. Others have hormonal differences or chromosomal differences that lead to variations of male or female, right? And there's situations that are more complicated than the binary. But when we rush to this essentialist logic, like how the Trump administration is now trying to change the definitions of gender, we ignore the reality and diversity of humanity. Constructionists understand, though, that social categories are impacted by the culture, meaning that it changes from culture to culture and within one culture over time, such as what it means to be a woman today versus 100 years ago, or a man today versus 100 years ago, or even what it means to be a person of color, right? These things change in the culture, the definitions. So again, back to the baby thing. I do think it's interesting that Colorado's doing this, and I know New York City does the same thing, but again, California doesn't. They passed some sort of resolution to say that the surgery should be condemned, but they didn't actually make it illegal. So again, a lot of these children are being, quote, changed because people think that they're not natural. And you're like, but they were born that way. How is that not natural? Alrighty, sexual orientation. Okay, so sexual orientation refers to whom one feels erotic and romantic desire to. And sexual identity or orientation and identity are connected, right, to different cultural meanings and values. So when we say it's socially constructed, that just means our ideas about what sexual orientation is and how people are labeled and categorized are a matter of human definition that's influenced by cultural, historical, and political processes. So heteronormativity is a fact in our culture. This is where heterosexuality is assumed to be normal and is taken for granted as the only mode of sexual expression. And so this is reinforced by us, or for us, by social institutions and social policies that abound in our culture. In a heteronormative culture, ooh, say that 10 times fast, right? Heteronormative, lots of syllables. In a heteronormative culture like America, heterosexuals are socially privileged because their relationship and lifestyles are affirmed in every facet of the culture. So, in the media, in the doctor's office, in the political office, in work, in religion, in institutions of marriage and family, right? This is why you don't have people yell things at heterosexuals that are holding hands walking down the street, or heterosexuals that are kissing in public don't get jeered at, right? For some reason. Um, Anywho, it's because it's socially privileged. So when we talk about the closet, it's not surprising that people would try to hide a stigmatized identity, and we'll see this in a film later in the course that talks about the situations before gay liberation. That life in the closet was just reality because being openly gay or lesbian could be a literal death sentence. So people were locked in mental institutions, they were kicked out of their families, they had to live on the streets. It was a dark time in policing sexual expression. In the modern era, many live closeted in some aspects of their life in order to avoid the stigma or maltreatment that can come with not being heterosexual. So sometimes people don't tell their families, or they don't tell their coworkers, or sometimes they tell no one. And while this seems to be a way to avoid maltreatment, this constant fear of being outed, of being, someone's going to figure it out, can be used as a form of social control that keeps lesbians, homosexuals, and bisexuals silent. So the chapter also explores how different people experience the closet differently. So they explored how social class could have an impact on coming out to one's family, or how men and women experience the closet differently. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more in depth when we watch the film. So, sexual identity is complex, right? So even when we look at this, we have to understand that the invention of the term homosexuality, the earliest use of the term, comes about in like medical documents in the late 1800s, right? So the earliest use of the term heterosexual in the US was also in a medical text, differentiating it from homosexuality. And before this, the term didn't really exist. And this confounds a lot of people because they're like, well, the Bible talks about homosexuality. And you're like, actually, it doesn't. Because the term didn't exist until the late 1800s. And pretty sure it was written before that. So Kinsey's research, again, is another thing that really challenges a lot of our assumptions about how these things work. So his research was the most comprehensive study on sexuality in the US at the time, in the 50s. And he introduced a scale to measure a person's sexual expression. He found that on the extremes, 50% said exclusively heterosexual, and 4% identified themselves as exclusively homosexual. But everyone else was somewhere in the spectrum in between, which could mean some measure of same-sex desire or some measure of same-sex contact, maybe experimenting in college. Or even some similar studies since, this has been replicated many times. Researchers recognize that sexual orientation can't be measured solely in terms of sexual activity, that it's a much more complicated expression of our desires, meaning, sometimes we try to, when we create these false binaries, you are this or you are that, we construct all those things in the middle to just not exist. But the idea that, someone hasn't at some point had same-sex contact or maybe a desire of some kind or something like that, really ignores the reality of people from 1 to 5 on the scale.